Welcome back. Welcome back to the podcast, Indestructible Souls, the podcast for the Black male, African American men and boys. My name is Jonathan Beauregard, your host of Indestructible Souls. I am a licensed psychotherapist and also the owner and proprietor of Beauregard Therapy, located in Colton, California, in the heart of the Inland Empire. So please check us out. Our group practice at www.beauregardtherapy.com. If you're watching on Facebook, please like and share. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like and share. If you're liking us on Instagram, please like and share. Yet again, my name is Jonathan Beauregard, and I got another new episode. So keep in mind, this platform is to push not only the culture forward mentally, but it's also to help us learn and get better as a people. So yet again, my name is Jonathan Beauregard, and before I get started, I am recording from Blue Cigar Lounge and Podcast Lounge. And so with this new platform, I get to do what I like to do, and that's cut and smoke. So as I get started, I'm going to go ahead and get situated. So I hope the smoke don't offend you. But today I'm going to enjoy while I talk to you, and I'll give you the topic in a minute. I'm going to enjoy a Rocky Patel vintage 1990. That's crazy. Wait a minute. I graduated in 1990. You mean to tell me I'm vintage? I guess so, right? I guess when you get in your 50s, are you considered antique yet? Just vintage? So as I get situated here, yet again, my name is Jonathan Beauregard, a licensed therapist. And one of the trends that I've been seeing in my practice is, as you know, people come for couples therapy. They bring their children for children's therapy, adolescents for therapy, so forth. And sometimes I might see whole families where I see the parent, one of the parents, then I see the kids. But one of the things that's been happening, and I like to come here and talk about some of the themes and trends that happens in therapy. But what I'm seeing now a lot of is children who are being raised in separated or divorced families. Let me go ahead and get this going. Children that are raised in separated or divorced families. And so today I thought it would be a good opportunity and a good idea to talk about that, because I think so many people, whether it's just due to ignorance, not understanding, whether it's emotional stuff, too many people don't consider the children or use children as a pawn in their scheme to defeat the other parent, right? So what happens is, as we're trying to defeat the other parent, we use our kid as collateral damage and not pay attention to the long-term effects of how children are affected by divorce or separated, or what I like to call is splintered families. So today we're going to talk about how children are affected by divorce, and I call it splintered families, meaning, they still have relationships with both parents, but what happens is kids become, like I said, become collateral damage. And what happens is, whether it's due to the fighting, deep-rooted resentments, adults losing sight of how their children are affected, all when they're trying to beat the other parent, all when they're at war with the other parent. And so divorce could have lasting and long-term effects on children. But I'm also going to talk about how children play the game too. Most people won't talk about that. Well, the reality is Sometimes we underestimate what children know. We underestimate what children see, and and particularly teenagers, they will use this split, they will use this situation to their advantage. And sometimes they play both parents like a fiddle to get what they want. So overall, I'm going to talk about how children are affected by divorce and what are some of the things we can do better when it comes to handling our children in these situations. Well, too often I see parents who are emotionally charged or have long-term resentments, and the children just becomes a tool to get back at the other parent. And what happens is they're not parenting to make sure that their child is okay. They're not parenting to make sure that their child is well rounded. They're parenting against the other parent. So when we talk about divorce and we talk about the children in divorce, children, depending on how you handle it, will determine how they will adjust, and not only adjust, if they're going to be affected long term, or or they're going to be affected mentally and emotionally. So let's get into it. So one of the things I want to talk about, just to kind of give you some background, the therapist in me, I got to always create a foundation. Can't just always go running my mouth. I got to always qualify what I'm saying, because I am a licensed professional. People have to not only understand what I'm talking about, have to have validity. So when we talk about parents who are separated, divorced, splintered for whatever reason, and sometimes not even, never even married, but broken up, and then now they got children in the middle, here are some of the long-term effects. Depending on the age, sometimes emotionally it affects children, because if mommy or daddy no longer love each other, does that mean they also no longer love me? So it affects children mentally and emotionally. So the attachment, emotional attachment to the parents is affected. Here's the other thing. Oftentimes, children wonder if it's my fault, especially in blended families, or when parents begin to use children as pawns. They now become a part of the relationship. They now become a part of the, basically the argument. They become a part of the fight. So they begin to wonder if it's their fault for the split or the divorce. Here's another thing, some of the long-term effects, especially with teens. Children are more resilient, meaning younger children. So they if handled well, they can adjust better. But particularly with teenagers, they can build anger and resentment to particularly one parent or both parents. Because when it comes to teens, their lives are affected differently, because their lives outside of the home become more affected. Losing friends, having to move schools, so forth and so on. And here's another thing, because teens are able to see the fight and they see what parents are doing and they going back paying attention, they're going to blame one of the parents. They might blame the dad, they might blame the mom. Here's another thing that a lot of parents don't want to face. Some children are relieved that you guys are getting a divorce. They see the mess. They see what dad is doing. They see what mom is doing. They're sick of the arguments. They're sick of the fights. So sometimes the children are relieved that their parents are actually getting a divorce. But sometimes parents want to stay together and they say, well, we want to stay together for the kids. In reality, they're just making the problems worse and worse and worse by staying together. So Another thing that happens with when it comes to divorce and parents or children with divorce is that it's going to automatically decrease contact with one or the other parent. Here's part of the problem. Most likely it's going to be the dad. Why? In most cases, the dad leaves the home, the dad is outside of the home, so it's automatically going to diminish the contact and the bond with the father. And if you have boy children, who's going to be affected the most, especially if son and father have a strong bond. So when we talk about the effects of divorce, too often parents get caught up in their own mess, they get caught up in their own emotions, and don't consider the long-term effects of how divorce or separation affects children. Here's the other thing. The custodial parent, which means the parent that's raising the child, that has the child or the children most of the time, who lives in that home, that stress increases. So therefore, the parent is stressed out more because they got to deal with the behaviors. They have to deal with the bills. They have to deal with everything, while the non-custodial parent, for the most part, is living on their own or could potentially be in another relationship in Disneyland, right? Here's another thing that most people don't realize. Now, mind you, I always check my information. I always check my facts. While mothers often are most likely going to be the custodial parent, the reality is when it comes to the children, particularly, mothers become less supportive and show less affection. Why? Because the mothers are under more stress. The mothers have to deal with things financially. The mother is affected emotionally. Most likely there's some type of distress going on. So therefore, there's less room for emotional well-being for the children and less room for affection and attention. Here's the other thing. When it comes to kids, sometimes the divorce isn't the most damaging thing. Like I said, some kids want y'all to get divorced because they're sick of y'all mess too. So some of the things, particularly for teenagers, the hardest thing is having to move to a new home. Sometimes you got to move to a smaller home. Sometimes some people may even have to move out of state, move in with relatives. They got to change schools. So they're losing their friends. Particularly adolescents, teenagers, they're more connected to their friends than they are to the family. So having to move creates a lot of stress. The other thing is now the entire family have less access to resources. So the new video game, the new this, the new that, money isn't the same. All because obviously the family is affected by the divorce. Here's the issue. Well, not the issue, but a issue. A teenager will always attempt to choose the best situation for them. So this is going to be the gist of what I'm going to talk about today, right? Is how when parents are coming to therapy and they're bringing their kids, is how the children now, particularly teenagers, get into the mix and things get even tougher. So sometimes step parents get involved. You may have new step siblings. And let me give this footnote real quick because I don't want to forget this point. If you are separated and or divorced and now starting a new relationship, I see this mostly with men, is that the new spouse, the new girlfriend, the new whatever gets involved in the business and becomes an active, willing participant and often the nemesis to the former spouse. I say the step parent, the new girlfriend needs to stay out of the mix. That is not their job, that is not their place. But most often, that parent is running game on the new spouse, and then now they teamed up, but all it does is create more stress. And it begins to affect children's mental health. It begins to affect their academic performance. It affects their behaviors, where we're starting to see more conduct disorders, adjustment disorders, impulsive behaviors, and so forth. Because the system that's been created that creates security and safety for the children has now been shattered. But often, here's what I see happen. Family separated, family divorced, they bring the kids to therapy and say, my kid is acting out. And very often they don't want to hear that not only the divorce is what's affecting them, but their behavior, meaning the parents, their behavior and how they're handling it is what's creating the stress. Because often parents are handling things out of spite, out of resentment, out of anger, and then they begin to use the kids as pawns. They begin to use the kids as weapons to defeat the other parent. So when we start talking about increased mental health problems, we're talking about adjustment disorder, depression, anxiety, and other behavioral problems. Risk-taking behaviors. You might even see substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and so forth. Here's what I see a lot, and this is what I really want to talk about, is when children and parents begin to parent against not parent for the well-being of the child, but what happens is one parent begins to create a Disneyland effect where they're creating an environment, they're not applying discipline, they're promising things that they can't follow through on, all to win the favor of the child. So what happens? Often, I want to live with mommy, I want to live with dad. And then now that child takes on the attitude, the resentment, and also takes on the same fight as the parent that they decide to side with to get what they want. All because we're not handling these situations effectively, all because we're not handling these situations with maturity, and we allow resentment, hate, disgust, and whatever else you want to call it to get in the way of how we're handling divorce, how we're handling the situation. Too often I see where parents will co-sign a child's bad behavior, make it the other parent's fault, all to win favor. What do you think that does to that child in the long term? But also, what does that child learn? That child begins to learn that mommy or daddy is the enemy, my behaviors are okay, but the problem is when that behavior outgrows the parent, when that behavior begins to get worse, now we got a bigger problem on our hands. All because we don't handle children properly when it comes to separation or divorce. The mature thing to do, the emotionally mature thing to do, is we have to learn to set ourselves aside in whatever issue we have with our former spouse for the greater good and for the greater cause, to make sure that our children emotionally, mentally, physically stay intact and are allowed to adjust, are allowed to express themselves emotionally, and are able to get through this process better. So how do we help children adjust when it comes to divorce? For one, here's the biggest one probably, learning to co-parent peacefully. Is that always possible? Well, it should be if we really say we love our kids, and some of us are staying longer in relationships because of the well-being of our kids. So we should be able to set our resentment and our anger aside to co-parent peacefully. The other thing is, stop putting your child in the middle. What do I mean by that? Your business with your ex, there's adult business and then there's children business. Any disputes, don't put them in the middle of your fights. Don't put them in the middle of your arguments, and allow them to see you guys working together collectively and not put them in the middle. Also, you have to learn to maintain healthy relationships. Well, that's probably even a taller order when a lot of us don't even know what healthy relationships look like. I'm not talking toxic, trauma bonded, emotionally hostage relationships. I'm talking healthy relationships. Both parents have to use consistent discipline. Too often I see one parent throw discipline out the window because they just want to look good to the child to win favor over the other parent. So when we talk about using consistent discipline, we should be able to communicate and say, this is what's going on. How are we going to co-parent this? And the discipline should be consistent across the board. Too often, oh, your mom, they shouldn't have did that, or your dad shouldn't have did that. Oh, that's too much, or this or that or the third. And what happens is that child now learns to manipulate. And when mom is trying to discipline, they can run to dad and escape to dad's house and make everything better. Now mom or dad becomes vilified, becomes the villain. Here's the other thing. Because the safety net is now splintered, the system is now splintered, we even have to monitor our adolescent or our teenagers even more closely. Why? Dad's out of the house, mom's out of the house. They're not working together collectively, which makes me more vulnerable to whatever's going on out in the streets, makes me more vulnerable to whatever's going on the internet, because now I'm looking, or the teenager is looking to latch on to other things that may be more unhealthy. So we even have to, and I don't mean in a strict over disciplined kind of way, but we have to monitor our teens even more closely when it comes to divorce or separation. I could give plenty of examples of how teenagers are strayed away and get themselves into whether it's trouble with drugs, things on the internet, and other behaviors that we don't want when it comes to divorce. I'm reluctant to give examples because then my clients might think I'm talking about them. So I can't give too many real life examples, but there are plenty of examples to where when the family structure is damaged, it affects our kids. Here's another thing. We have to empower our kids, and we have to be able to demonstrate coping skills. Just like this divorce or this separation is stressful for you, it's also stressful for the kids because their system, their safety net is now damaged. We have to help our kids feel safe, but if we're a mess and if we're doing things and we're warring with the other parent, how do they feel safe? And when possible, please get education and also seek therapy. But you might need to take a parenting class. You might need to take a co-parenting class. But the biggest thing is get out of your own way so your children have a chance. The last thing you should do is stay in a relationship for the sake of the children. I hear that way too often. Like I said earlier, a lot of kids see it and they can't wait for you guys to separate or divorce because they're tired of it too. And all it does is create a hostile environment, which makes things worse. Here's what happens when you're warring against each other. When parents are at war, constantly at war. Everything you do is in spite of your ex. Everything you do is to win the upper hand. Everything you do is to win in court or whatever. I have my own opinions about court. The thing is, the less you have to do in court, the better. Quit putting your fate and your family in the hands of the court system. Sure, we got to handle divorce through the courts, but we don't have to do all the fighting in court. We should be able to figure some things out. The relationship's over. Sit down like adults and figure it out. But when we're at war, children are trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong, and believe it or not, who's good or who's bad and whose side they need to take. But if parents are mature, children shouldn't have to figure out who's right or who's wrong, and they shouldn't have to choose sides. But naturally, what happens is they're trying to figure out who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad. And a lot of times, believe it or not, the mistrust, and dad is often portrayed as the evil one or the one with the misbehavior. So therefore, the resentment a lot of times is directed to dad. And when you fight in court, don't think that kids don't see that. Don't think that kids don't understand that. So all that does is create an atmosphere of more stress, tension, and it becomes more adversarial. And how are kids supposed to exist in that? The reality is the children becomes a victim of your conflict. So I say, as much as you can avoid dealing with things in court and you could deal with things together, the better. Here's the other thing. Don't let, and I talked about this earlier, but I'm going to spend some time on this. Don't let the new step parent, the new girlfriend, the new whatever dictate what happens in court. I know this happens for a lot of men. When it's time to go to court, that new woman, when it comes to spousal support, child support, whatever that be, that new woman is in court making sure you file those papers and making sure you make your ex look as bad as possible because they understand the outcome of what happens in court is going to benefit them more. Keep them out of it. They ain't got nothing to do with it. That new partner needs to stay in their lane. We can argue about it, but whatever. My opinion is that they create an atmosphere, they create more problems, and yet again, they assist in alienating the other parent for their own benefit. Then you have to ask yourself the question is who's running the show? Because the kids are very clever. So when they see that the parents are all splintered and fighting against each other, they're going to play it like an orchestra. And then they become in charge and then they run the show. So you have to ask yourself the question, are you using your children to win the war against your former spouse? What does that look like? Well, are you trying to gain favor so that you're looking the other way? Are you not applying discipline so the child likes to be with you more? Are you promising them things you can't follow through on? Are you creating an atmosphere of Disneyland so they rather be at your house? Are you creating or saying things that are disparaging so your former spouse becomes the enemy? Oftentimes I see parents fail to discipline to win favor. Or the house is laxed because they rather want the child there, and then they want the child to go in court, and things that are normal parenting are used in court, but it's magnified and it's made to feel like it's causing stress for the child, and now that parent is on the hot seat. When under normal situations, what those parents do are right in line with discipline and so forth. Are you undermining your counterpart, your former spouse, to gain favor? What does it look like when you undermine? Whatever they say don't go in your house, even if it's right. Are you being difficult for the sake of being difficult? Are you co-signing your child's bullshit? Yeah, I said bullshit. In a lot of cases, we underestimate the cleverness, the awareness of these children because they get it and then they use it to their benefit. Why? Because we're so blinded by our disdain or our hate for our former spouse that we become ineffective as parents. Why is this so important for us to talk about? So as a therapist, I see this a lot in therapy, where families are broken. You have well-intended and concerned parents making sure that their children are well adjusted. However, everything breaks down when you war against your former partner. We, meaning us adults, we can agree we no longer are compatible. There might be some domestic violence involved. There might be some infidelity involved. There might be all of these reasons why we divorced or separated or were never married. But the children don't have to be collateral damage. The children don't have to become pawns in our game to win against the other parent. The consequences could last a lifetime, but if handled correctly, which I already talked about, if handled correctly, children are able to adjust to the new system. They're able to adjust to the new norm and still have the ability to become well-rounded adults. We have to make sure that we're mature enough and emotionally well enough to set our stuff aside for the sake of our children. I'm not saying you got to be friends, but I am saying you have to be adult and mature. Think about that for a minute. Too many kids are finding themselves lost and begin to latch on to things that are unhealthy, whether it's the internet, drugs, unhealthy relationships, crime, behaviors, whatever it may be, because their system fell apart. And then their system are using them to win the war. So when it comes to children of divorced families, if handled correctly, they're going to be fine. Most often, parents can move on and have happy lives with the new spouse or whatever they choose to do. We have to make sure our children don't become collateral damage and then they're damaged for the rest of their lives. So yet again, we have to make sure we protect our children even in the most dire situations. Yet again, my name is Jonathan Beauregard. This is the podcast Indestructible Souls. And you can find me at BeauregardTherapy.com. It is now Beauregard Family Therapy Group. Please go to the website. You can look at the other therapists and their credentials. And this has been the Indestructible Soul, the podcast for Black men and boys. Peace.
Yeah.